The bullet didn't ask permission. It tore through the afternoon air on a Chicago street that smelled like diesel and late October cold, and it found the wrong body, not the one it was sent for, not the convoy guard, not the diplomat's aide standing 3 feet to the left. It found Iver Sol. And Iver Sol did not scream. That was the part people kept talking about afterward, not the shooting, not the blood soaking through the shoulder of his cream wool coat, not the child he had thrown himself over, pressing that small shaking body into the asphalt while the second and third shots punched through the black SUV behind them. What people kept talking about was the silence, how a man could take a bullet and make no sound at all, like he had already practiced disappearing. Hi viewers, have you ever stayed silent about something painful for so long that the silence started to feel like your only protection? Drop your answer in the comments. I genuinely want to know. Mika was 4 years old, maybe 5. Iver never got a clear answer on that later. What he knew in that moment was the weight of the child against his chest, the warmth of small fingers gripping his shirt, and the wet spreading cold in his left shoulder that told him the wound was real. Around them, men in black tactical gear were shouting into earpieces. Black SUVs were pulling tight formations. Someone was calling a name, not his name, never his name, because nobody in that convoy was supposed to know he was even there. He had been a ghost for 7 years. Ghosts don't have names on convoy manifests. The street cleared in under 90 seconds. That was how fast Ardan security moved when something went wrong. Iver had heard about it before, the way they operated, clean, precise, no wasted motion. He had heard the name Ardan the way most people heard weather warnings. Distant, serious, something to prepare for. 2 black Tesla SUVs swung hard around the corner with a sound like controlled thunder. Men stepped out before the vehicles fully stopped. One of them looked at Iver on the ground, at the child still pressed against him, at the blood, and said nothing for exactly 3 seconds. Then he spoke into his earpiece. "We have the Omega, he's been hit, the pup is uninjured." Iver looked up at the grey sky and thought, very clearly, this is how it ends, not the wound, the word, Omega, said out loud on a Chicago street into a secure channel that connected directly to the 3 most powerful men in the private capital world. He had spent 7 years making sure that word never mattered, never applied to anything about him that could be used, and now it was floating above him in cold autumn air like a flag planted in new territory. He tried to sit up. The security operative put one firm, not unkind hand on his unwounded shoulder. "Don't." Iver stared at him. The man didn't flinch. "We're taking you somewhere safe." Safe, that word again. People always used that word right before they handed you to something worse. Mika made a small sound against his chest. Not crying, something quieter than crying. A child who had already learned that crying didn't always help. Iver understood that language fluently. He pressed his hand against the child's back and kept it there until the paramedic arrived and the world went grey at the edges and then went completely away. He woke up in a room that cost more than his parents' house. That was his first thought. Genuine, flat, almost funny in the way shock makes things funny. The ceiling was high and panelled in pale ash wood. The light came from sources he couldn't immediately locate, soft and directionless, the kind of light that architects charge fortunes to install. The sheets against his skin were a thread count he didn't have a number for. His left shoulder was wrapped, elevated, and numb in the specific way that meant real medication had been involved, not the drugstore kind. He was alive. He was also, clearly, inside an Ardan property. He knew before he saw the monogram on the ceramic water cup on the nightstand. He knew from the silence itself, the particular quality of quiet that comes from a building engineered to keep the outside world completely out. Triple-paned glass, reinforced walls, the soft, constant breath of climate control so perfectly calibrated it barely registered as sound. He had grown up in houses that tried to imitate this kind of silence and always failed. The Ardan estate didn't try. It simply was. He sat up slowly, his shoulder pulled, he ignored it. The door was closed but not locked. He tested it with one glance. The handle was lever style, no keypad, no visible sensor. Either they trusted him or they wanted him to believe they did. He stood, found his balance and walked to the window. Outside was a garden that should have been impossible in November. Low structured hedges in geometric lines, a stone path cutting through dark winter grass, outdoor lighting placed with the precision of a museum exhibit. Beyond the garden, a long row of black Tesla vehicles sat in a covered bay like a line of patient, waiting things. The estate grounds stretched in every direction until they met a tree line so dense it looked like a wall. No exit he could see, not easily. Somewhere behind him, a door opened. He turned. The man who stepped into the room was tall in the way buildings are tall, not aggressive about it, just structurally inevitable. dark hair pulled back from a sharp face, gold amber eyes that moved across the room and landed on Iver with the particular focus of someone who already knew the answer to the question they were about to not ask. He was wearing a black shirt, no tie, sleeves rolled to the forearm, no performance, no presentation, like he had walked straight from actual work. Iver recognized him from photographs, from financial headlines, from the kind of news coverage that happens when someone moves enough money to shift a market. Iver Ardan, the one they called most dangerous in private circles, not because he was violent, because he was the kind of quiet that people with real power sometimes chose, the quiet that meant every word he actually spoke landed like a closed case. He looked at Iver standing by the window, shoulder bandaged, still in the medical gown they had apparently dressed him in while unconscious, and he said, "You're awake." Iver held his gaze and said nothing. He had 7 years of practice. His face did not change, his breathing did not change. He simply waited, the way water waits, without apology and without movement, until the person across from him understood that nothing was coming. Iver watched him for a long moment. Then he nodded once, as if Iver had confirmed something he already suspected, and crossed to the small table near the window where a covered tray had been sitting unnoticed. He lifted the cover. Food, real food, not hospital food, ceramic bowl, something warm, a small plate with sliced fruit arranged without fuss. He set it on the nightstand and looked at Iver one more time. "Mika is in the next room," he said. "The child is fine, eating more than I've seen some adults manage." He left. No questions, no explanation of what would happen next. No terms, no conditions, no speech about protection and responsibility, and what Iver owed them for pulling him off a Chicago street. Just information that mattered, the child is safe, and then the door closing softly behind him. Iver stood in the center of that expensive, silent room, and felt something he had not felt in a very long time. Off balance. Because that was not how men with power behaved. That was not the script. The script had pressure in it, gratitude expected, decisions implied, futures quietly redirected while someone smiled and called it care. He knew that script. He had been handed it since childhood. He could read it in the dark. Iver hadn't handed him a script. He had just handed him food and left. Iver sat on the edge of the bed, picked up the water cup, ceramic, not crystal, he noticed that specifically, and took a careful sip. His shoulder throbbed. His mind ran fast and controlled behind his still face, cataloguing everything. The door, the window, the garden, the vehicles, the man with amber eyes who walked like a closed verdict. 3 of them, that was what every headline said. 3 Ardan heirs, all triplets, all operating as a single unit when it mattered. He had only seen one. The other 2 were somewhere in this building. He set the cup down. Somewhere down the hall, he heard a child laugh. Mika's laugh, he knew it already, after 20 minutes of shared terror on an asphalt street. High and sudden and completely unguarded, the laugh of a child who had forgotten, just for a moment, that the world could be dangerous. Iver closed his eyes. He had made a promise to himself 7 years ago. Standing in his childhood home, watching his cousin pack a single bag and leave for a life that had already been decided for him. The promise was simple: no one gets to decide. Not his parents, not their ambitions, not the billionaire dynasties circling Omega bloodlines like they were assets on a balance sheet. Not anyone. That promise had cost him a voice he still had. And now the most powerful alpha triplets in the country had pulled him off the ground, cleaned his wound, fed him from ceramic dishes, told him the child was safe, and walked away without asking for a single thing in return. Which meant one of 2 things. Either they were different from every story he had told himself about power, or they were patient in a way that scared him more than pressure ever could. He opened his eyes. On the ceiling, the soft hidden light held steady. Outside, the black Teslas waited in their covered row. Somewhere in this immaculate, impossible house, 2 more men with amber eyes were going about their evening like nothing unusual had happened at all. Iver reached for the food. He would eat, he would heal. He would stay silent and stay sharp and figure out exactly what kind of men these were before they figured out what kind of man he was. What he did not know, what he could not know yet, was that the figuring out had already happened. One of them already knew his secret, and had known it for longer than Iver had been inside these walls. What would you do if the only thing keeping you safe was a secret, and someone already knew it? Comment below. And stay right here, because Chapter 2 is where the convoy attack comes back around, and what Iver sees in that security footage changes everything he thought he understood about why the bullet found him. The footage was 43 seconds long. Iver found it by accident on the third morning, when a security tablet left open on the kitchen counter, cycled through archived feeds, and stopped on external camera 7, East Side, Chicago Street, timestamp reading 2:47 p.m. The afternoon everything changed. He stood in the kitchen in a borrowed grey shirt and sweatpants, ceramic coffee cup in both hands, and watched himself step out of a rideshare 2 blocks ahead of the Ardan conv. He watched himself notice the child standing alone near a concrete barrier, confused, looking in the wrong direction for someone who wasn't coming. He watched himself cross toward Mika. And he watched, very clearly, the black SUV that had been parked on the corner since before he arrived turn its engine on. Not when the convoy appeared, before any visible reason to move, before the shooting started. That SUV had been waiting for him specifically. His hand tightened around the ceramic cup. The coffee inside had gone cold. Behind him, someone entered the kitchen. He didn't turn. He kept his eyes on the tablet screen on the footage on the specific timestamp, 2:44 p.m., when that SUV's engine started, 3 minutes before the first shot, 3 minutes before the convoy even turned onto that block. We pulled that same clip yesterday. The voice was different from Sears, warmer in tone but somehow more precise, like a scalpel wrapped in good manners. Iver turned. Lucero Ardan stood in the kitchen doorway in a dark charcoal sweater, holding a folder the way someone holds a thing they've already memorized. He was built close to Sear, but moved differently, less monument, more current. The same amber eyes, but in Lucero's face, they looked like they were constantly computing something just behind the conversation. He didn't look at the tablet, he looked at Iver. The vehicle wasn't after the convoy, Lucero said. The targeting was personal. Someone tracked your rideshare booking and placed the shooters before the Ardan team even left the building. Iver set the cup down on the counter. His face stayed neutral, his pulse did not. Someone had targeted him, not as collateral, not as incidental. As the point. 7 years of careful invisibility, of making himself small and unremarkable and unclaimable by reputation, and someone had looked directly through all of it and decided he was worth a bullet. Lucero set the folder on the counter beside the tablet. He did not push it toward Iver, did not tell him to open it, just placed it there and moved to the coffee machine like men don't get shot at every day in his world. Iver looked at the folder, then at Lucero's back, then at the folder again. He opened it. Inside was a name, a photograph, and 3 pages of financial connections mapped in the clean, merciless language of forensic accounting. The name meant nothing to him yet. The photograph showed a man with a generous smile and careful hair, the kind of face built for podiums. The financial connections ran from a Connecticut pack through 4 shell companies to a private legal firm that specialized in one very specific area of family law. Omega custody and placement proceedings. Iver read every line, twice. The kitchen was quiet except for the coffee machine and the sound of his own controlled breathing. When he looked up, Lucero had turned around, 2 cups on the counter. He pushed one toward Iver without asking, without looking for a reaction, and picked up the other. You don't have to say anything, Lucero said. I'm not telling you because I need a response. I'm telling you because you have a right to know who wanted you off the board before you walked into whatever this is. Whatever this is. Iver looked at him. That phrase was too honest for performance, too unpolished for a man trying to manage him. Nobody running a manipulation used the words whatever this is. It admitted uncertainty. It admitted that even Lucero Ardan, who could read financial forensics the way other men read sports scores, did not have a clean name yet for what was happening between 4 people in this house. Iver picked up the coffee cup. He did not drink from it immediately. He held it with both hands the way he had held the first one, carefully, like warmth was a thing to be rationed, and looked at the folder again. The pup, Lucero said quietly. Mika was not a random child in the wrong place. According to what we've traced so far, Mika is connected to a placement case currently running through one of those shell firms. Someone wanted the child isolated. The attack created chaos. Chaos creates paperwork gaps. Iver's jaw tightened. Just once, a small movement that most people would miss. Lucero didn't miss it. He said nothing about it. Down the hall, the sound of Mika's voice carried through the walls, not the words, just the cadence of a child explaining something elaborate and important to a patient adult listener, a low voice responding, patient, unhurried. Severin. Iver had not yet properly met Severin Ardan. He had seen him twice from across rooms, tall, silver blonde in a way that looked architectural rather than soft, moving through the estate with the particular efficiency of someone who had no wasted gestures. The one, according to everything Iver had catalogued, who ran the operational side of Ardan Capital, the one who made the decisions that the other two executed. But right now, Severin Ardan was in a hallway somewhere talking to a 4-year-old about something elaborate, and his voice through the walls sounded like someone who had nowhere else to be. Iver looked back at the folder. The generous smiled man, the Connecticut pack, the shell companies, the custody pipeline. Someone had built a very clean, very legal machine for moving omegas and unattached pups through a court system that would look like protection from the outside. Exactly the kind of machine that needed no witnesses, no noise, and no injured omega, with a clear view of the targeting vehicle sitting in security footage with a timestamp that told its own story. He was a problem for that machine. Mika was a problem for that machine. And now they were both inside the most secured private estate in the Northeast Corridor, which was either the safest place on Earth or the most elegant version of the trap he had always feared. He closed the folder. He looked at Lucero, who was watching him with those calculating amber eyes that somehow managed to feel, not warm exactly, but not cold either, something in between that Iver didn't have a word for yet. He tapped the folder once with 2 fingers. Lucero nodded, reading it correctly. "It's yours, keep it." Iver tucked it under his arm and walked out of the kitchen. Behind him, he heard Lucero set his coffee cup down and say, to no one very quietly, "Yeah." Like something had just been confirmed. Like Iver had just answered a question he hadn't known was being asked. He walked down the hall. The sound of Mika's voice got louder. He stopped at the open doorway of a small sitting room and looked in. Mika was on the floor surrounded by what appeared to be an entire ecosystem of paper animals, cranes, frogs. Something with too many folds to immediately identify, explaining each one to Severin Ardan, who was sitting cross-legged on the floor in a tailored black shirt that probably cost more than most people's car payments, holding a half-folded paper square in his large hands with complete and genuine focus. Severin looked up and met Iver's eyes. He didn't stand, didn't straighten into authority, just looked at Iver with a steady, uncomplicated expression and said, "She's been teaching me, I'm terrible at this." Mika looked up too, her whole face changed when she saw him. "Iver," she said his name like it was a complete sentence, like it meant, "You're here, things are okay, I have been making animals and waiting." He stepped into the room, sat down on the floor beside her without thinking about it, the folder pressed against his ribs under his arm, his shoulder aching, his mind running its fast and private calculations. Mika put a paper crane in his hand. He looked at it. Small, precise, the folds perfect in the way a child's folds never quite are, which meant Severin had been making them for her all along, and letting her believe she'd made them herself. Iver looked up at Severin. Severin was looking at the paper square in his own hands, still folding, very deliberately not returning Iver's gaze, giving him the privacy of that realization without making it into a moment. Iver held the crane. His throat moved once. And for 1/2 second, in a room with a child and a billionaire sitting on a carpeted floor, surrounded by paper animals, 7 years of practice silence almost cracked straight down the middle. Almost. The folder under his arm felt like a warning, like a reminder of exactly how expensive trust could be when the wrong people collected the debt. He pressed his lips together and looked back at Mika. She was already explaining the frog. He stayed on the floor and listened. And somewhere in the estate, 2 men who shared the same amber eyes and the same blood were doing something that would not make sense to Iver until much later. They were each, separately, quietly, doing nothing at all. Not pressing. Not asking. Not moving in the direction of the thing they already knew. Which was the most dangerous thing they could have done. Because patience, in the hands of people who have all the time in the world, is not kindness. It is a completely different kind of claim. The closet was the size of a room. Iver stood in the doorway of it on his 4th morning in the estate, and looked at what they had placed inside without ever mentioning it, without fanfare, without a single conversation about what it meant. Clothes his size, all of it. Not the obvious brands, not the Gucci statement pieces or the Hermes accessories arranged like museum objects that a different kind of powerful man would use to announce a position. These were specific. a charcoal wool coat from the row in exactly the cut he would have chosen himself, 3 pairs of dark denim in the right rise, a slate grey cashmere pullover, Stuart Weitzman boots in his size sitting at the base of the rack like they had been there all along, waiting for him to catch up. No tags, no receipts visible, no note. Just the right things in the right sizes, placed without ceremony, as if someone had simply paid attention. Iver stood in the doorway for a long time. He was trying to find the angle. Every gift he had ever received in his life had an angle built into it. His parents' Prada at 16 came with the angle of a dinner they needed him to attend. The Marc Jacobs wallet at 18 came with the angle of a meeting with the Ardan family's advance team that he had not been told was a meeting until he was already inside the room. Gifts were not gifts, they were architecture. Load-bearing gestures designed to hold up the structure of an expectation. So he looked for the structure. He found nothing. Not nothing, he found a ceramic mug on the nightstand with tea already steeping inside it, the temperature exact, the kind that meant someone had timed it to approximately when he woke up, which meant someone had listened for his movement through the wall and sent the mug in without knocking. That was the detail that got him, not the clothes, the tea, because the clothes required money and a stylist and 30 minutes of online shopping. The tea required someone paying attention to the specific rhythm of one person's morning. He got dressed, he drank the tea, he did not allow himself to feel anything that would be useful to someone watching. On the 5th morning, Severin was in the kitchen before him. This was unusual. The mornings had been private up to that point, a quiet agreement no one had verbalized. The estate gave him early hours to move through without navigating their presence. But Severin was at the counter with a laptop open and 2 plates of food already on the table, and he looked up when Iver came in with the flat, non-demanding expression Iver was beginning to recognize as his default. "Sit if you want," Severin said. "I'm working, won't bother you." Iver sat. He pulled the second plate toward him, eggs, toast, some sliced avocado, no performance of gourmet refinement, and ate while Severin worked, and the kitchen held the specific quiet of 2 people choosing not to fill space with noise. This went on for 20 minutes. In those 20 minutes, Severin closed 2 financial documents, replied to what appeared to be 7 emails, took 1 call that he ended in under 40 seconds with 3 words, and did not once look at Iver with the particular focused weight of someone waiting for something. On the 6th morning, he was there again. On the 7th, Iver got to the kitchen first. He stood at the counter and did not think very hard about what he was doing and made 2 cups of tea. When Severin came in 4 minutes later, 1 cup was already waiting. Severin looked at it, then at Iver. Then he sat down, pulled the cup toward him, and opened his laptop. They ate in the same quiet as before. Neither of them acknowledged what had just happened. But something had. That afternoon, Iver was exploring the estate's east wing, carefully mapping exits and sight lines the way he had always mapped new spaces, the habit too deeply written to stop, when he found the room. Small, off the main corridor, door slightly open. Inside, a floor-to-ceiling bookshelf, a reading chair, a window with garden view, and on the small table beside the chair, a notebook. Open, not hidden, not placed with intent, just left there the way a person leaves something when they plan to come back. He should have kept walking. He stopped. The page facing up was not text. It was a diagram, lines connecting names, organizations, dollar amounts, handwritten in blue ink with the particular compression of someone thinking faster than they were writing. He recognized the connected names immediately because he had read them in Lucero's folder 3 mornings ago, the shell companies, the legal firm, the Connecticut PAC. But there were additional connections here, 3 new names, one of them circled twice. A judge. A family court judge in New Jersey, with a 17-year record of placement decisions that consistently moved pups and unattached omegas toward a very small cluster of approved facilities. Iver stood at the doorway and read the entire page. His shoulder was healing but not healed, and the slight pull of it kept him present, kept the reading from becoming abstract. This was real. Someone in this estate had been pulling that thread for longer than Iver had been inside these walls, maybe longer than the Chicago attack, maybe much longer. He heard a step behind him and turned. "See ya." Standing in the corridor with a folder of his own, looking at Iver with no expression that Iver could read immediately. That amber gaze settled on the open notebook, then on Iver's face, and stayed there. Iver didn't move. Sia didn't move either. "That judge," Sia said, after exactly the kind of pause that is not about searching for words but about choosing them, signed 14 placement orders in the last 8 months, We've confirmed 4 of those placements directly connect to the shell network. He paused again. 2 of those pups haven't been publicly located since. The hall was very quiet. Iver held Sia's gaze and felt something shift in his chest that was not grief exactly, not yet, but was adjacent to it in the way that winter is adjacent to darkness. 2 pups not located, somewhere inside a machine that wore the face of protection. He looked back at the notebook. "You can come in," Sia said, "if you want to see the rest." He walked past Iver into the small room, pulled the second chair from behind the door and set it across from the reading chair. Then he sat in the reading chair, opened his own folder, and waited. He did not make it a question. He made it an opening. Iver stood in the doorway for 3 full seconds. Then he went in. He sat across from Sia in the small room with the garden window and the bookshelf and the handwritten diagram, and Sia walked him through 4 months of documented connections, without once looking at him like he was performing, without once letting his voice carry the weight of someone building toward an ask. It was the cleanest briefing Iver had ever witnessed. And somewhere in the middle of it, he realized he had stopped looking for the angle. That scared him more than the diagram. Because the diagram at least made sense. Networks and shell companies and corrupt judges, those were the grammar of every powerful story he had ever been told. He could read that language. He had spent his whole life reading it. But men who briefed you on danger without using it to position themselves, men who fed you from ceramic dishes and made paper animals for children and left tea timed to your footsteps, he had no language for that yet. He sat in the small room as the garden light shifted from afternoon gold to early evening grey, and he let himself listen. And he did not speak. But for the first time in 7 years, the silence felt different in his mouth. Less like armor. More like a door he had forgotten he could open. He pressed his lips together. Not yet. Behind his steady eyes, the question he had refused for 7 years was stirring with a new and frightening force. What if the thing he had built to keep him free was now the thing keeping him from something he didn't have a word for yet, but was beginning, against every careful plan he had ever made, to want? The sound came through the nursery wall at 11:17 on a Tuesday night. Sia was in the adjacent study working through a capital restructuring document that had already eaten 4 hours and still wasn't finished, and the estate was down to its nighttime quiet, that deep, engineered silence that meant the security rotation had turned over and the staff had retired, and the only people awake were the kind who couldn't stop thinking. He heard it through the wall. Soft, low, not quite speech. Singing. He went still. Not the reaction of a man startled, the reaction of a man who immediately understood that what he was hearing was not meant for him, and that the next decision he made in the following 3 seconds would matter. He set his pen down. He did not lean toward the wall. He did not move closer to the door that connected the study to the short corridor outside the nursery. He sat in his chair and he listened. The voice was quiet enough that individual words dissolved into tone and shape rather than meaning, but the shape of it was unmistakable, low and unhurried, with the particular cadence of a melody being delivered from memory rather than performance, the kind of singing that happens when a person forgets they're alone, or forgets they were ever performing in the first place. It went on for maybe 3 minutes. Then it stopped. Sia looked at the capital restructuring document on his desk and did not read a single word of it for the next 6 minutes. He had understood Iver's silence from nearly the beginning. Not completely, he was not arrogant enough to claim that, but the outline of it, the functional architecture, the specific, deliberate nature of a silence maintained not by trauma but by choice. He had encountered enough people who used damage as performance to recognize when the inverse was happening. Iver was performing the damage to protect the choice. Why was a different question, one Sia had chosen, very deliberately, not to answer on Iver's behalf. He picked up his pen. He finished the document. He did not tell his brothers what he had heard, not that night. 3 doors down, in a different wing of the estate, Severin was pulling a small item from the back of a nightstand drawer in the room that had been prepared for Iver before his arrival. It had been found during the standard security sweep of a guest room that a visiting staff member had previously occupied, a small spiral notebook. Inside it, 14 pages of phonation exercises, vowel extension drills, the kind of structured, progressive work that a speech therapist assigns for someone rebuilding vocal range and clarity after extended disuse. The handwriting in the margins was Iver's, The dates ran back 11 months. Severin looked at it for a long time. He put it back in the drawer and closed it and stood in the empty room for a moment, looking at nothing in particular. Then he went back to his own room and did not mention it to anyone. Lucero was the last to confirm what the other two had separately begun to understand. His route was the most methodical because that was how Lucero worked, not instinct first, but evidence assembled until the picture was complete enough to stake something on. He had traced the origin of the silence back through public records, interview archives, and one quietly obtained file from a Maryland family court. The marriage negotiation records were sealed, but not impenetrably so, not for someone with Lucero's access and patience. What he found was not shocking, but it was specific in the way that makes a thing worse than a general wound. Iver had been 19 when the first formal approach was made by a Maryland-based estate on behalf of a capital family looking to consolidate an Omega lineage connection. 20 when the second approach came. 21 when his parents began discussing terms without telling him. The silence, by all traceable evidence, had begun at 21, 3 months after those discussions started, and had not broken publicly since. 7 years. Lucero closed the file. He sat in his office in the north wing and looked at the wall, which was just a wall, nothing on it, and he felt something that he would not have described to anyone, but that sat in his chest with the specific weight of a thing that mattered. He had been 19 once. He had understood what it felt like to look at a future that had been decided before you could argue with it. The Ardan triplets had been born into power, which most people assumed was protection. In some ways it was. In other ways it was simply a larger cage, and the first years of their 20s had been the process of establishing, through considerable force of will and some legal restructuring, that they were the ones who decided what their futures looked like. They'd had each other for that fight. Iver had walked into his alone, at 21, and his weapon of choice had been the quietest one available. Lucero did not find this sad. He found it, in the specific and clear-eyed way he found most things, impressive. The three of them did not convene to compare what they had each separately learned. That was the important part. There was no meeting, no decision made about how to proceed, no strategy session in Severin's office where they mapped out an approach. Each of them had arrived at knowledge through their own route, and each of them had made the same choice in the privacy of that knowledge. Say nothing. Do nothing that made it worse. Let the man have his silence until he chose differently. What they did instead was small and consistent, and completely intentional. Severin removed every piece of crystal from the kitchen and the main dining room and replaced it with ceramic and matte glassware. He gave no explanation. He did not announce it. The crystal simply disappeared one morning and the replacements were already in place before Iver came down for breakfast. When Iver's gaze moved across the table and registered the change, Severin was looking at his laptop. He did not look up. Lucero spent 40 minutes on a day that had 17 other demands talking to the estate cook about food. Not Iver's medical dietary restrictions, which were already accounted for, but the smaller things, the textures that were difficult, the smells that were sharp, the specific preparation of one dish that a Maryland catering receipt from a family event 6 years ago suggested Iver had quietly avoided every time it appeared. The cook understood the assignment without being told it was an assignment. Iver's plate never held any of those things again, and no one mentioned it. Sia, for his part, began spending 30 minutes in the evenings on the nursery floor. Not because Mika required it. Mika had the full attention of a dedicated estate staff member during the days and slept well and was, by every observable measure, adjusting with the resilience that children sometimes have access to and adults forget. Sia sat on the floor because Iver came to check on Mika every evening at the same time, and because the first time he had arrived to find Sia there, not waiting, not watching, just existing in the same space, something in Iver's face had shifted by 1 degree in the direction of less wary. 1 degree. Sia was a patient man. The paper animals were Mika's idea. She had found a folding guide on a tablet during afternoon activity time and decided that everyone in the estate needed to learn, and Sia had been the most accessible target. He was genuinely bad at it. The creases were too hard, the angles slightly off, the precision he applied to everything else failing him completely at a task that required softness in the execution. Mika found this hilarious. On the 9th evening, Iver came to the nursery doorway and found Sia on the floor with a nearly finished paper crane that had one wing longer than the other, and Mika explaining with great patience and zero mercy exactly what he had done wrong. Iver sat down on the floor beside her without being asked, took the crane out of Sia's hands, unfolded it, and refolded it cleanly in 40 seconds. He placed it on the floor between them. Mika clapped. Sia looked at the crane, then at Iver's hands, then at Iver's face, which was doing the specific thing it did when Iver had just done something instinctive and was now processing whether it had been a tactical error. "Thank you," Sia said. Iver held his gaze for one moment. Then he looked back at Mika, who was already selecting the next animal. There was no acknowledgement of what had just happened, no swelling significance, no charged atmosphere, nothing that would make Iver feel the need to retreat from it, just a crane on the floor and a child explaining frogs and a room holding its particular warmth. But under the surface of that ordinary evening, something had moved. Trust is not declared, it does not arrive like a headline. It moves like groundwater, invisible, beneath everything, finding its level through the slowest pressure. And in that room, on that 9th evening, something had moved 1 degree further in the direction of a thing that none of the 4 people in that estate could yet afford to name. What none of them knew, not even the 3 men who had been careful and patient and exactly right, was that the ground beneath all of it was already shifting. 40 miles away, in a Hartford, Connecticut office, a man with a generous smile and careful hair was looking at a photograph. The photograph showed a silver-haired Omega standing near a garden window in a private estate, captured from a long-distance lens through a gap in the perimeter hedge. The man with the careful hair looked at it for a while. Then he picked up his phone. He almost said Mika's name out loud. That was how close it came. A Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks into the estate, Mika running in from the garden with a scraped knee and that particular pre-cry expression children make where the pain hasn't caught up to the sound yet, and Iver was already moving toward her, already kneeling, already reaching for the small leg to look at the damage, and the name was in his throat, formed and ready and 1 breath away from being real. He caught it. Just. He pressed his lips together and made a small sharp sound, not speech, not quite, and Mika looked at his face and said, immediately, "I'm okay, it's okay, it doesn't hurt that bad," which meant it did hurt that bad and she was managing him. 4 years old and already managing him. He cleaned the knee in silence, applied the small bandage from the kit in the bathroom, held her for a moment while she breathed through the tail end of the almost tears, and the entire time, the name was sitting behind his teeth like a coal still carrying heat. He had been close before. In the first weeks the closeness had been fear-adjacent, his body reacting to stress, silence slipping under pressure the way all held things eventually try to move. He had managed it, pressed it back down, reinforced the habit with the same focus he had used for 7 years, a slow breath, a return to center, the reminder of what the silence protected. But this was different. This was not fear. This was the specific and unfamiliar pressure of wanting to be present, really present, not the observational presence of a man standing outside a life and watching it carefully, but the inside kind, the kind that uses your actual voice to say a child's actual name when she comes in bleeding. That difference frightened him more than the closeness itself. He put the first aid kit back under the sink and stood in the small bathroom and looked at himself in the mirror. Silver grey hair, blue eyes carrying something complicated that he was trained enough in self-awareness to identify and disciplined enough in survival to not yet name. Shoulder healed to the degree that it no longer pulled when he moved. He looked like a man who had been somewhere long enough to stop looking like a visitor. That was the problem. He had been mapping exits since the first morning. He had catalogued the tree line, the vehicle schedules, the rotation patterns of the security team, the 3-minute window between the southeast camera sweep and the east perimeter check. He had a route. He had always maintained a route. It was non-negotiable, the same way the silence was non-negotiable. The knowledge that leaving was possible was the thing that made staying bearable. Except now, when he ran the route in his mind, he encountered a problem he hadn't built the route to solve. Mika. He could not take her without a legal basis. She was in Ardan protective custody through an emergency family court order, one that his presence in this estate had no formal standing to contest or modify. If he left alone. And if he left alone, she was here without the one person she consistently ran to when something went wrong. He stood in the bathroom and thought about that for a long time. Down the hall, someone knocked on the nursery room door and Mika called out, "Come in," and a voice he now recognized as belonging to the estate's afternoon staff member said something warm and ordinary about afternoon snack, and the world kept moving at its mild and manageable pace, while Iver stood very still inside a problem that didn't have a clean answer. He left the bathroom, walked to the East Wing reading room, Sear's room. He thought of it now, though no one had labeled it, and stood in the doorway. Empty, good. He sat in the reading chair, which he had begun to do in the afternoons when it was unoccupied, and he pulled the folder Lucero had given him on the third morning out from behind the cushion, where he kept it, and went through it again. He had memorized most of it. That wasn't the point. The point was the process, going through evidence with his own hands, his own eyes, in his own sequence. It was the same cognitive habit he had used to manage everything for 7 years. Information was the thing you controlled when you couldn't control the situation. Senator Haldan Rook. He had done more research since Lucero's briefing. The estate had a secured library terminal that he had begun using late at night when the house was quiet. Public records, congressional hearing transcripts, published op-eds in 3 major national papers, donor disclosure filings. The picture that assembled from those sources was clean and specific, and made his stomach move in the way that correctly identified threats always did. Rook was not a blunt instrument, he was an elegant one. The public face was all reform language, omega safety, pup protection, family court modernization. He had given speeches at Harvard Law. He had a 78% approval rating in his state. He was photographed regularly at charity events with expressions of concern so practiced they had become genuinely indistinguishable from real ones. And underneath all of it a pipeline, quiet, legal on the surface, moving people through courts and into facilities and private placements with the efficiency of a supply chain. Iver looked at the photograph in the file. The generous smile. He knew that smile, not this man specifically, but the category of it. His parents had worn versions of that smile at every event where they displayed him. The financial families had worn it at every meeting where they assessed him. It was the smile of people who had decided that their vision of order was worth whatever it cost the people inside it. He closed the folder. Across the room, the window showed the garden in late afternoon light, and beyond the garden, the tree line, and behind the tree line, the road, and beyond the road, the world that had been moving along without him for 3 weeks. He thought about his cousin, the diamond wedding, the Louis Vuitton luggage, the deadness in his eyes 6 months later. He thought about Mika's scraped knee. He thought about a paper crane refolded in 40 seconds and set on a floor between him and a man who said thank you, and let it be exactly that. He pressed the folder flat against his knees. The silence in the room was his, all of it. No one was here to watch him hold it or lose it or push against the edges of it. He was completely alone. So when his throat moved, there was nobody to hear it. He breathed out. And in the space of that exhale, very quietly, almost too small to count, Iver Sol let a single syllable leave his body. Not a word, not a name, just sound. Just the smallest proof of voice, released into an empty room, swallowed immediately by the estate's engineered silence. He sat with the aftermath of it. His hands were steady, his face was still, the folder was flat against his knees. But something that had been held in a locked position for 7 years had moved. 1 fraction. 1 exhale's worth. And the next thought that came was not relief, not terror, but the one thing he had spent the longest time keeping out. What happens after the silence? He had no answer, he had never needed one. The silence was supposed to be permanent. The silence was the plan. The silence was his proof that he could not be claimed, could not be managed, could not be moved into someone else's design for his life. But the silence had been built in a world where no one offered ceramic cups timed to his footsteps. Where no one replaced crystal without explanation. Where no one sat on the floor and let a child correct them, and never once used that child to perform warmth they didn't actually have. The silence had been built against a different world. And the world outside this chair had, without asking permission, become different. He stood up, smoothed the folder, put it back behind the cushion, walked to the window and looked at the tree line. The route was still there, the 3-minute window, the southeast camera gap, all of it still precise, still usable. He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at the garden. Mika was outside now, bandaged knee already forgotten, crouched near a low hedge with the estate staff member, examining something in the dirt with the total and magnificent focus of a child who has decided that this particular thing is the most important thing in the world. Iver watched her, and somewhere behind the fortress of his own silence, something he had no safe word for yet was making a sound. It's not loud, but persistent. The kind that doesn't stop just because you don't answer it. 40 miles away, Senator Ardan Rook was setting his phone down. The man he had called had just confirmed what the photograph suggested. Iver Sol was not behaving like a temporary guest. He was behaving like someone who intended to stay. And that, Rook said to himself in the clean and organized quiet of his Hartford office, was a problem that needed to be resolved before the gala in Annapolis. Before anyone in that room could hear a voice they weren't supposed to know existed. The applause started before Rook finished his sentence. That was the thing about him. He had trained a room the way other men trained dogs, with repetition and reward, until the clapping came automatically, before the thought even finished forming. The Hartford Policy breakfast was 240 people in a ballroom that smelled like fresh lilies and old money, and every single one of them was leaning slightly forward in their chairs, the way people lean when they believe they are in the presence of someone who matters. Senator Ardan Rook stood at the podium in a charcoal suit that had been pressed into geometric perfection, and smiled at the room like he was genuinely glad to see them. He was not glad to see them. He was glad they were useful. Omega welfare, he said, pausing for the specific beat that his speech coach had identified as optimal for emotional landing, is not a political issue, it is a moral one. Maury applause. Rook let it run 3 seconds longer than necessary, then raised one hand, not to stop it, to shape it, to direct the energy of it toward the next thing he needed the room to feel. In the third row, his chief of staff, a compact woman named Devorah Sains, was watching the room instead of the stage. That was her job, reading the temperature, identifying the faces that needed a personal follow-up after the event, the donors whose expressions had shifted from polite engagement to genuine interest, the ones who could be converted from check writers into advocates. She was very good at her job. She was also, at this exact moment, looking at her phone under the table at a photograph her contact had sent 40 minutes ago from a long-range lens. An omega by a garden window. Silver hair, blue eyes. A stillness about him that read differently depending on who was looking peaceful to someone who didn't know better, and to someone like Devorah, who had built a career on reading people, something far more controlled than peace. She forwarded the photo to the secure file. At the podium, Rook was moving into the section of the speech that Devorah had written for him, the personal testimony portion, where his voice dropped half a register, and his eyes went to the middle distance, and he talked about a cousin, a friend, a constituent, always unnamed, always just real enough to land. I have sat across from omegas who had no legal standing to refuse a claim, he said, no court that would hear them, no structure that protected their autonomy. We are building that structure. The room believed him. That was the gift, not the smile. Any politician could maintain a smile through difficult questioning. The gift was the consistency of the belief he produced in other people. They left his events feeling like they had met someone trustworthy. They wrote checks. They made calls. They repeated his language in their own conversations until the language became the common vocabulary for what he was doing. What he was doing was not protection. What he was doing was a pipeline so clean and so legal in its surface mechanics that the only people who could dismantle it were the ones who had already been inside it. People like Iver Sol. After the breakfast, Rook walked the rope line with Devorah one step behind him and spoke to 17 people in 22 minutes. First names, brief personal details recalled with the intimacy of someone who cared about individuals, all of it assembled from briefing notes he had read in the car. When the room cleared, he found the corner table where his attorney was waiting. The attorney's name was Marcus Fell. He was 46, slim, with the specific affect of a man who had been told his whole life that his intelligence excused his ethics. The Sol situation, Rook said without greeting. Fell opened his portfolio. He's been in the Ardan estate for 23 days. Our contact confirms he has unrestricted access to the estate grounds, access to a child in Ardan emergency custody, and no legal documentation formalizing any relationship to the Ardan principles. Rook looked at the portfolio without touching it. That's the angle, he said. Undocumented involvement with a pup in a contested custody situation. An omega with a 7-year public record of non-communication being given unsupervised access to a vulnerable minor. He paused. Welfare concern. Warrants a formal inquiry. Fell made a note. The Ardan legal team will respond immediately. Let them. Rook's smile had not moved. I don't need to win the legal argument. I need the argument to exist, publicly, loudly enough that the Annapolis gala becomes a conversation about whether the Ardan dynasty has appropriate judgment, whether their omega guest is stable, whether a child in their care is safe, He picked up his coffee. That's all I need. Fell closed the portfolio. The Omega's silence, he said carefully, is the core issue. If he cannot testify. He cannot testify, Rook said. That's been confirmed for 7 years. He said it like a fact, like the ground under his feet. He was wrong. He just didn't know it yet. Devora, who had heard every word of this conversation, and had been in every conversation like it for 6 years, and had told herself every year that this was the last one, looked at the photograph on her phone again under the table. The Omega by the garden window. Something in the stillness of that face. She put her phone away. She did not make the call that, 6 years in, she had never made. But for the first time, she thought about it the entire drive back. Meanwhile, at the Ardan estate, Iver was standing at the secured library terminal at 11:43 at night reading the public agenda for the Annapolis Gala. His name was not on it. But Mika's case number was buried in the footnotes of a policy amendment discussion item listed under Family Court Modernization, Agenda Point 7, co-sponsored by Senator Halden Rook. Iver read it 3 times. Then he opened the shell company documentation from Lucero's folder and cross-referenced the legal firm listed under the amendment's supporting organizations. Same firm, same network. He sat back in the chair. The gala was 19 days away. He pressed his fingers flat against the desk and felt his own pulse working, steady and too fast, in the tips of them. Rook was going to use a policy stage to move Mika's case into a public framework that would make it harder to contest, easier to transfer, and entirely legal on the surface. He was going to do it in front of donors and cameras, and 200 people who would applaud because they had been trained to, the same way a room full of people that morning had applauded a speech about protection from the man running the machine that made protection necessary. Iver closed the terminal. He walked back through the dark and quiet estate to his room. Sat on the edge of the bed. In 17 years of watching powerful people maneuver, he had learned one thing with absolute clarity. The only play against elegant cruelty was not matching its elegance. It was interrupting it. With something it hadn't prepared for. He sat in the dark a long time. Then he went to the drawer by the nightstand, the one where Severin had once looked and said nothing, and he pulled out the small spiral notebook. 14 pages of phonation exercises, 11 months of margin notes in his own handwriting, the map of a voice relearning its own territory. He opened to the first page. And for the first time, he didn't do the exercises in the abstract, in his throat, in silence. He let sound out. Small, controlled, nothing anyone 3 feet away would hear. But real. In the dark of his room, with the estate sleeping around him, and a man 40 miles away setting a trap that required him to stay silent, Iver Sol opened his mouth and practiced. The paper was warm from the printer. That was the detail that stayed with him. Not the words on it, not the case number, not the judge's name he had already seen circled twice in a handwritten diagram in a reading room 3 weeks ago. The warmth. The specific, ordinary warmth of a document that had been printed less than 2 minutes before Iver walked into the estate's secondary boardroom to return a tablet he had borrowed. He picked it up before he understood what it was. He understood what it was before he finished the first paragraph. Mika, full legal name, case number matching the footnote from Agenda Point 7, transfer authorization to a specialized residential placement facility in New Jersey. Signed, not pending signature, already signed, by the family court judge whose name lived in a diagram behind a reading chair cushion in the estate's east wing. Date of intended transfer, 14 days from today. 3 days before the Annapolis Gala. Iver stood in the empty boardroom with the warm paper in both hands and felt something happen in his chest that he did not have a practiced response to. Not fear, he knew fear's geography. This was different. This was the particular heat that lives just behind the sternum when something you have quietly and carefully begun to love is suddenly in direct danger, and every calculation you have run for your own protection becomes secondary in under a second flat. His hands were steady. The paper shook anyway. He folded it once precisely and put it inside his shirt against his ribs. He left the boardroom. He walked back through the corridor toward the main wing, and his footsteps were even, and his face was its practiced face, and inside his body, a decision was assembling itself with the cold, clear speed of something that had been waiting for the right weight to tip the scale. He found Lucero first. Not because he had planned to, because Lucero was in the kitchen, standing at the counter with a laptop and a cold cup of coffee, and he looked up when Iver came in and immediately put the laptop down. He did that. Iver had noticed it every time. Whatever was open on that screen when Iver appeared, it closed. Not in concealment, in prioritization. The message, delivered consistently and without being stated, "You are not an interruption." Iver pulled the folded document from inside his shirt and placed it flat on the counter between them. Lucero looked at it. He read it in the specific way he read everything, not fast, not slow, but with the precise attention of someone who was simultaneously reading the document and building its implications into a structure that would hold weight. He looked up. Iver held his gaze and waited. "This was printed inside this building," Lucero said. "Not a question." Iver nodded once. Lucero's expression did not shift into something dramatic. It shifted into something quieter and considerably more dangerous, which was the specific look of a man who had just confirmed that the perimeter he believed was secure had a gap in it. "Someone on the estate staff," Lucero said, "has been passing location and behavioral reports to Rook's office for at least 3 weeks. He paused, maybe longer. The warmth of the paper. Someone had printed that document inside these walls on an estate network using credentials that had cleared security, which meant Rook had not just been watching from outside, he had been watching from inside. The photograph taken through the perimeter hedge, the behavioral reports, the timeline that put Mika's transfer 3 days before the gala. It had all been assembled from within. Iver looked at the document on the counter. 14 days. He looked back at Lucero and did something he had not done in any of their conversations before. He pointed to himself. Then he pointed at the document. Then he held up both hands flat and turned them over, a gesture clear enough in any language. "What do I do?" Not asking for reassurance, asking for the actual play. Lucero looked at him for a moment with those calculating amber eyes that had always reminded Iver of someone solving for a variable. "You already know," Lucero said quietly. "The question is whether you're ready." Iver picked the document up off the counter. He folded it back and held it. Inside his ribs, the exercises from the spiral notebook were running, involuntary, like a body preparing for something the mind had not yet formally agreed to. The vowel shapes, the breath control, the careful reconstruction of a voice that had been held in place so long it had developed its own kind of strength from the stillness. Lucero did not push. He never pushed. That was the thing about all three of them. They had never once pushed. And Iver had grown up being told that people with power pushed, that it was the nature of power to expand into every available space, that the only way to survive it was to give it nothing to expand into. But these three men kept encountering his edges and stopping there. Not because they didn't see the edges, because they respected what the edges were protecting. Iver looked at the document one more time. Mika's name, the case number, the judge, the facility in New Jersey. He thought about his cousin, the Louis Vuitton luggage, the dead eyes at the diamond wedding. He thought about a child on the floor being handed a paper crane made by someone who cared enough to make it imperfect so she could correct it. He thought about the warmth of this paper in his hands, evidence of a machine that smiled and used words like protection and welfare and care while it moved children through courts like inventory. His jaw tightened. Just once. He set the document on the counter, walked to the kitchen door and stopped. He didn't turn around. He stood there with his back to Lucero and the document and the cold coffee and the laptop, and he took one breath, and in a voice that was rough from disuse and quiet enough that it barely crossed the room, he said, "I'll be ready." 2 words. 7 years of silence, and they came out like the most ordinary thing in the world, like they had simply been waiting behind a door that was never locked, only held. The kitchen was completely still. Lucero did not react with anything large. He did not move toward Iver, did not make the moment into something it couldn't hold. He simply said, in the same even tone he used for everything, "Okay." Iver walked out. Down the hall through the east wing to the nursery, where Mika was asleep in the way children sleep when they feel safe, arms wide, face completely open, no defenses assembled even in unconsciousness. He stood in the doorway and looked at her. 14 days felt like a very long time. It was not a very long time. He went to his room and opened the spiral notebook. He practiced until 3 in the morning. He did not sound like himself yet. He was getting there. The chandelier in the Annapolis Gala Hall was the size of a small car. 212 crystals, each one throwing light in a different direction, and beneath it, the kind of crowd that only assembles when money and politics occupy the same room at the same time. Governors, capital directors, foundation chairs, the Maryland State Attorney General in a corner near the bar, drinking water and watching the room with the expression of someone who had been told to be there and intended to make it efficient. Iver walked in wearing the charcoal coat from the closet that no one had explained. His shoulder was healed, his hands were still. His face was the face he had worn for 7 years at every event his parents had forced him to attend, composed, unreachable, giving nothing away. Behind that face, his heart was running at a rate that no external measurement would confirm. The Ardan triplets had arrived separately, by design. Severin in conversation with the state infrastructure director near the east entrance. Lucero at the donor reception table reviewing the evening's policy agenda with the kind of focused attention that made people assume he was simply doing due diligence. Sear at the bar, alone, in a black suit that had been made for him by someone who understood that the most powerful statement a man in his position could make was perfect stillness. None of them looked at Iver when he entered. That was also by design. He moved through the room the way he always had, present enough to be seen, unremarkable enough to be ignored. He accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing server. He found a position near the west wall where his sightline covered the stage, the main entrance, and the 3 corridors feeding into the hall. Senator Halden Rook was already at the reception area, working the room with the precision of a man who had attended 400 events exactly like this one. The charcoal suit was different from Hartford, but the energy was identical, warm, certain, unhurried. He moved from cluster to cluster with genuine-looking delight, the kind that stops being performance and becomes muscle memory after enough repetitions. He had not yet seen Iver. Devora Sains was 3 steps behind him, tablet in one hand, phone in the other, managing the evening's logistics with the efficiency of someone who had stopped sleeping enough years ago to forget what it felt like. She scanned the room. She found Iver. She looked at him for exactly 2 seconds, and then looked back at her tablet, and Iver watched her face make a very small and very private calculation that she gave no one else access to. The evening ran its first hour without incident. Dinner, 2 introductory speeches, a foundation award presentation for a children's literacy initiative that produced the appropriate amount of applause and the appropriate amount of genuine feeling. The crowd was warming. The room was doing the thing rooms do when they have been carefully prepared, becoming a single organism, a shared mood, a collective openness to whatever the headlining speaker was about to say. Rook took the stage at 9:17. He began, as he always began, with the personal. A story, an omega he had met during a Connecticut town hall 3 years ago. The specific details of powerlessness, no legal standing, no court, no advocate. The way the story moved from individual to systemic, the way it always did, the bridge from one person's pain to a policy argument that felt inevitable by the time he arrived at it. The room listened. The room believed. And then, in a turn that had not been on the official agenda, Rook looked up from the podium and said, "There are those who will tell you that advocacy is enough, that we can protect the most vulnerable through goodwill and good intentions." He paused, but goodwill has no standing in family court. He let that land. There is currently a case moving through the New Jersey family court system involving a minor pup whose care arrangements have been, shall we say, irregular, emotionally compromised by unlicensed, unvetted involvement from an individual whose own mental and communicative fitness has never been formally evaluated. He did not say a name. He did not have to. We are not here to attack individuals. We are here to ask the hard question: who protects the child when the adults around that child are too compromised to do it? The room went very still. In the back, someone started a murmur. At the east entrance, Severin had stopped his conversation. At the donor table, Lucero's pen was no longer moving. At the bar, Sear had turned his glass once on the surface in front of him and set it down. And near the west wall, Iver Sol set his sparkling water on the ledge beside him. He moved. Not fast, not with the quality of someone reacting, with the quality of someone arriving at the place they had been walking toward for a very long time. The crowd parted around him, the way crowds part for people moving with absolute certainty. He reached the edge of the stage access corridor. A security operative stepped into his path, not aggressively, procedurally, and Iver looked at him with the flat, direct gaze of a man who has already made his decision, and found the operative taking one step to the side before he apparently understood why. He walked up the 3 steps to the stage. Rook saw him when he was 6 feet away. The generous smile did not disappear. It adapted. It became the smile of a man who knows he has just been handed a better story than the one he planned, an unstable omega walking onto a stage uninvited, confirming every concern he had just raised. He stepped back from the podium with a gracious gesture. "Please," he said into the microphone, warm and wide, "if our guest has something to add to this conversation." Iver stepped up to the microphone. He looked at the room. 212 chandelier crystals threw light in 212 directions, and every single face in that hall was pointed at him. He thought about 7 years. He thought about the warmth of a printed document against his ribs. He thought about a paper crane, imperfect, set on a floor between him and a man who didn't use kindness as currency. He thought about his cousin. He thought about 2 pups not publicly located since their placements. He opened his mouth. "My name is Iver Sol." His voice was rough, not broken, rough, the way a road is rough when it has been cleared but not yet finished. Real, completely, unmistakably real, with the texture of something that had been kept in a locked room and was now standing in 212 lights. The room did not move. "The case Senator Rook just referenced," Iver said, and his voice steadied with each word the way a person steadies when they realize the thing they feared most has already happened and they are still standing, "involves a child named Mika. A child I carried out of a convoy shooting 6 weeks ago. A child I have been with every day since." Rook's smile had stopped adapting. "The facility Senator Rook's amendment is designed to place that child in," Iver continued, "is operated by a subsidiary of Halcott Family Services LLC, which is a subsidiary of Meridian Child Placement Partners, which receives primary funding through a PAC called the Connecticut Family Foundation." He paused. "Senator Rook is the Connecticut Family Foundation's founding board member." Someone in the 3rd row made a sound. "The judge who signed the transfer order for this child is the Honorable Franklin Tate of the New Jersey Family Court. Judge Tate has issued 47 placement orders in the last 32 months. 41 of those placements went to facilities within the Meridian network." He looked directly at Rook. "I have the documents, all of them, the shell structure, the PAC contributions, the placement records. The 2 children from the 2023 Meridian transfers who do not have confirmed public locations." The murmur in the room had become something larger. The Maryland State Attorney General had put down his water glass. Devorah Sains, 3 steps behind Rook and slightly to his left, was looking at her phone. She was not reading it. She was holding it. She was making a decision. Rook stepped back to the microphone. "With respect," he said, voice warm and precisely controlled, "this individual has a 7-year documented history of communicative incapacity. Whatever is being alleged here, we should consider the source." "I have a 7-year documented history," Iver said, "of choosing not to speak. Those are different things." The room broke open. Not loudly, not the way movie moments break, with music and chaos and immediate resolution. The way real rooms break when a truth arrives that has too many witnesses to contain, with a spreading, unstoppable quality, like water finding its level, like a held thing finally released. Rook's face did something it had probably never done in a public setting. It became uncertain. And in the specific silence of that uncertainty, the 2-second gap between his last word and his next breath, Devorah Sains pressed send on a message she had been drafting, deleting, and redrafting for 6 years. She sent it to the Attorney General's office. Subject line: documentation, Rook Meridian Pipeline, complete file. The chandelier threw its 212 pieces of light in every direction. And Iver Sol stood in the center of all of it and did not look away. Sia heard him singing before the gala. Not the night of before, weeks before, and he had made a choice then, in the dark of his study, with a capital restructuring document open on his desk and a voice coming through the nursery wall, to do absolutely nothing with what he knew. That choice had looked like restraint. It was also, he understood now, standing in the corridor of the Annapolis hotel, while security teams moved in controlled patterns, and Lucero was on the phone with their lead attorney, and Severin was walking a very specific path toward the Maryland State Attorney General, something else entirely. It was a bet on a man he had met 6 weeks ago on the floor of a sitting room with a paper crane between them. He put that thought down and moved. The immediate aftermath of a room that has just broken open is never what the movies prepare you for. It is not dramatic confrontation and immediate resolution. It is logistics. It is very fast, very quiet decision-making by people who understand that the next 48 hours determine what the next 48 months look like. Rook had left the stage with his attorney and 2 personal security operatives. His public face was still engaged and unconcerned, in the way of a man performing unconcern for the cameras he knew were tracking him. But his attorney's hand on his elbow was not the hand of someone who believed tonight was recoverable without significant immediate action. Iver was in a side room off the main hall with the estate's head of security and a woman named Kezia Marshall, the Ardan family's lead attorney, who had arrived at the gala 40 minutes before it started and had spent the entire evening in a corner of the reception area with a tablet and a very patient expression, waiting. Sia knocked once and went in. Iver was sitting in a chair near the window. The roughness was still in his voice. Sia could hear it in the brief exchange with Kezia as he entered, but the quality of it had changed from what Sia had heard through the nursery wall, less tentative, more inhabited, like a person settling into a room they had been standing outside for a long time. Kezia looked up. "We have a 6-hour window before Rook's team files a counter-narrative with the press." "We won't need 6 hours, Sia said. He sat down across from Iver. For a moment, the room held only the sounds of Kezia's typing and the muffled activity from the corridor. Sia looked at Iver. "You should know," he said, "that we've been holding documentation on Rook's network for 11 weeks. He paused. "We were waiting for the right moment to move it to the Attorney General's office in a way that couldn't be buried." Iver looked at him without expression. "Tonight was that moment," Sia said, "not because we needed you to speak, because what you did from that stage cannot be strategically neutralized the way a document transfer can be. You made it a witness account, public, on record, in front of the Maryland AG." The room was quiet. "We did not plan your speech," Sia said. "We did not know you would walk onto that stage." Iver held his gaze. "But you knew I could," he said. 2 sentences, his voice still rough, still finding its full range, but present in a way that made the air in the room different. Sia looked at him steadily. "I heard you through the nursery wall at 11:17 on a Tuesday night, 3 weeks after you arrived. You were singing." Iver did not flinch. He sat very still, the way he did everything, with the complete, composed attention of a person who has trained themselves to receive information without immediately reacting to it. "I didn't tell my brothers that night," Sia continued, "not because I was keeping it from them, because it wasn't mine to share." At the desk, Kezia had stopped typing. "Severin found the speech exercises in the nightstand drawer," Sia said. "First week you were here, he put them back. He didn't mention it for the same reason." He paused. Lucero traced the origin of the silence back through the Maryland family court records about 10 days after your arrival. He understood why before any of us said a word to each other about it. The window behind Iver showed the Annapolis night, the harbor lights, the water moving under them, the particular stillness of a city that has no idea what just happened in one of its ballrooms. "We talked about it once," Sia said, "the 3 of us, about 3 weeks in when it was clear that Rook was accelerating his timeline. We decided," he stopped, chose the next word with care. "We agreed that the decision to speak was yours, that we would not use what we knew to move you towards something you hadn't chosen." Iver's throat moved. "Even if staying silent meant Mika's case went uncontested," he said. "It was not a question." Sia met it directly. "We had other legal avenues for Mika's case. They were slower, they were messier, they did not involve asking you to do something that should only happen when a person is ready." The room held that for a moment. Outside, footsteps in the corridor, Lucero's stride, identifiable now, quick and even. He came in without knocking, looked at the 2 of them, and sat on the edge of the desk with the efficient movement of a man whose mind was already 3 steps ahead. "AG's office has the full file," Lucero said. "Devora Sains, Rook's chief of staff, sent a 6-year compiled documentation package from her personal account 40 minutes ago. The AG's senior investigator confirmed receipt." He looked at Iver. "Whatever she had been carrying, she sent it tonight." Iver thought about the woman 3 steps behind Rook, holding her phone, making a private calculation. Rook's attorney has already called our office twice, Lucero continued. He's framing tonight as an ambush, emotional manipulation, leveraging a vulnerable Omega for political theater. Let him, Severin said. He was in the doorway. None of them had heard him arrive, which was, Iver had learned, entirely characteristic. Severin came fully into the room and closed the door behind him. He looked at Iver with the direct, unhurried gaze that had been the same since the first morning in the kitchen, when he had put a second cup of tea on the table and sat down without explaining why. 14 investigators have already filed information requests based on the public statement, Severin said. That statement is now on record in a room that included the Maryland AG, 4 state legislators, 2 federal donor registry contacts, and every major press outlet covering Omega policy. He paused. Rook's attorney can frame it however he likes. The witnesses are already time-stamped. Iver looked at all 3 of them. The same amber eyes in 3 different faces, carrying 3 different qualities. Sear's settled certainty, Lucero's calculating precision, Severin's operational clarity. 3 men who had been patient in the way that actual patience works, not as waiting but as active choosing, every single day, to give one person the space to come to a decision without being pushed toward it. He thought about 7 years. He thought about the cousin he had watched lose his voice to a system that called itself care. He thought about the speech exercises in the drawer that Severin had replaced without a word. He thought about the tea, the paper crane, the ceramic cups, the 47 placement orders, and the 2 children without confirmed locations, and a document warm from a printer held against his ribs. He looked at Severin. Mika, he said. One word, his voice carried it. The transfer order is void as of 1 hour ago, Severin said. Judge Tate's bench access has been suspended pending investigation. The New Jersey family court issued an emergency stay. He met Iver's eyes. She's not going anywhere. The window showed the harbor lights. The water moved. Iver sat in the chair near the window in a borrowed charcoal coat, with 2 words of speech in front of a chandelier and a filled room in his body like a stone dropped into water, and felt the rings of it still moving. He had thought for 7 years that the silence was the thing he was made of. But silence is not a person, silence is a choice. And underneath it, this whole time, had been a voice that had been getting ready. Not for a podium. For this room. For the moment when the people who had earned the right to hear it were sitting close enough to receive it. He looked at the 3 of them and he said, in a voice that was rough and real and entirely his own, I need to go back, I need to see her. No one spoke. Then Sia stood up. Cars outside, he said. The foster papers were signed on a Thursday. Not in a courthouse, not in a lawyer's office, at the kitchen table of the Ardan estate. With a ceramic mug in Iver's hand and Mika on the floor 3 feet away, explaining to no one in particular why the paper frog she had made was superior to all previous paper frogs, and Kezia Marshall sliding the completed documentation across the table with the specific efficiency of a woman who considered good outcomes the only acceptable professional result. Iver looked at the papers. His name, Mika's name, the legal language of permanence. He picked up the pen. He signed. Mika looked up when she heard the pen set down. She looked at the papers on the table, then at Iver's face, and said, with the flat, direct accuracy of a child who understood more than she was supposed to, Is that the one that says I stay? Iver looked at her. Yes, he said. She nodded once, the way children nod when information confirms something they already decided, and went back to her frog. In the weeks that followed the gala, the world moved in the way that consequential things move when they are finally set in motion, not with the cinematic speed of a story edited for time, but with the grinding, thorough persistence of actual change. Senator Halden Rook resigned from his committee assignments 11 days after Annapolis, citing personal reasons. Nobody with any information believed the personal reasons. The Connecticut Family Foundation filed for dissolution 3 weeks after that. The Meridian Network was placed under federal investigation through a joint task force that included the Maryland AG's office, 2 federal agencies, and a civil rights legal coalition that had been trying to crack the placement pipeline for 4 years, and suddenly had 17 new pieces of evidence to work with. Devora Sains testified voluntarily. Her 6-year documentation package turned out to be the most comprehensive single-source evidence in the investigation. She had been keeping records since year 2. She had stayed for reasons she explained in testimony, with the particular, careful honesty of someone who had asked themselves the same question for a long time and had finally arrived at an answer they could live with. She had stayed because leaving felt like abandoning the documentation, because she believed, for most of those years, that the evidence she was building would matter more eventually than any earlier exit would have. Iver read her testimony in full. He thought about a woman holding a phone in a gala hall, looking at a photograph of a man by a garden window, making a private calculation that no one else saw. He did not find it easy to understand, but he found it human. That distinction had become important to him. Judge Franklin Tate was removed from the bench pending a full ethics review. 14 of his placement cases were reopened. 3 pups, not 2, 3, were located in facilities that had not appeared in any official registry. They were moved into vetted foster situations within 60 days of identification. Iver testified publicly on 2 separate occasions, not because Kezia required it, not because the Ardan legal strategy needed it, because the pipeline had operated in part on the assumption that omegas inside it would not speak. Each public account that contradicted that assumption made the next one easier for someone else to give. He testified clearly. His voice by then had its full range back. It sounded nothing like he had expected, not the voice from before. He had been 19 the last time he used it consistently, and 19 was a long time ago. This was different, lower, more settled, like the voice of a person who had chosen their words instead of having them assigned. He liked it. That surprised him every time. The question of the triplets did not resolve itself quickly or cleanly, because real things do not resolve quickly or cleanly, and Iver had a 7-year education in exactly what happens when you rush a process that requires patience. What happened instead was slower and more specific and considerably harder to walk away from. Severin started leaving the kitchen before Iver finished his breakfast on days when Iver seemed to need the room to himself, and started staying when Iver's body language said the opposite thing. He had always been good at reading the difference. He got better. Lucero sent him a financial analysis once, unsolicited, on a Wednesday afternoon of the Omega Advocacy Legal Fund that Iver had mentioned in passing wanting to contribute to. Not with a recommendation attached, just the information, clean and complete, because he had happened to be looking at it and thought Iver might want it. That was all. The communication style of a man who thought about what you needed before you had finished asking. Sia spent Tuesday evenings on the nursery floor. That did not change. What changed was that Iver stopped coming to the doorway and stayed outside it. He came in. He sat on the floor across from Sia with Mika between them, and sometimes he talked about the testimony, about the investigation updates, about Mika's current opinion on paper animals, which had evolved into a formal ranking system, and sometimes he didn't, and both options were always acceptable. On a Tuesday in February, Mika fell asleep during a paper folding session before either of them had noticed how late it had gotten. Sia carried her to her bed. When he came back, Iver was still on the floor with a half-finished crane, and the room was quiet in the way it gets when a child's presence leaves and takes its particular warmth with it. Sia sat back down. They stayed there for a while. Not performing anything, not building toward anything, just 2 people in a room where the light was low, and the quiet was the kind that had stopped needing to be filled. Iver set the crane down. The court partnership documentation, he said. Kezia mentioned it. Sia looked at the crane. It's an option, he said, not a requirement. Separate residences available. Shared custody support for Mika, documented legally regardless of whatever else is or isn't decided. He paused. Nothing changes for her unless you decide it does. Iver was quiet for a moment. That's the part I keep coming back to, he said, that you set it up so the answer could be no without it costing her anything. Sia looked at him then. The answer should always be able to be no, he said, without it costing anyone anything. That's not generosity, that's just the minimum. Iver looked at the crane on the floor. He thought about the minimum. He thought about every version of care he had encountered in his life that had been constructed to make no impossible by attaching the cost to someone else. His parents, the financial dynasties, the polished table settings and the Prada at 16, and the meetings he arrived at not knowing they were meetings. He thought about ceramic cups. About a drawer that had been searched and restored. About a voice heard through a wall and held privately for 6 weeks. He looked at Sia. "I'm not ready to answer the big question yet," he said. "I know," Sia said. "But I'm not going anywhere," Iver said. Sia looked at him with those amber eyes that had been the same since the first morning, settled, unhurried, carrying the specific quality of a person who has somewhere comfortable to wait. "I know that too," he said. The crane sat on the floor between them. Outside, the February garden was bare and geometric, and patient in the way of things that understand that warmth comes back, not because it is forced, but because it is the nature of seasons to complete themselves. Mika slept in the next room with the particular depth of a child who knows that when she wakes, the people she needs will be there. Iver sat on the floor of the estate that had been a trap in his imagination and a home in its actuality, with a half-finished paper crane between him and a man who had heard his voice in the dark and chosen silence in return, and felt something settle in his chest that he had not felt since, before he understood what the world wanted from him. Not safety exactly. Not love yet, though it was close in the way that February is close to spring, present in the temperature of things, unmistakable if you knew how to read it. Something quieter than both. The knowledge that he had gotten here by his own choice. That every door he had walked through because he decided to. That the silence had been his. And the voice, rough and real and entirely his own, was his too. No one had taken either one. No one had been allowed to. And that, in the end, was the whole story. Not the pipeline dismantled, not the senator finished, not the documents filed and the cases reopened and the children found. All of that mattered, all of that was real and necessary and worth every cost. But the thing that lasted, the thing that could not be legislated or litigated or taken by anyone with a long-range lens and a generous smile, was a man who had walked into the hardest years of his life and come out the other side still choosing. Still present. Still his. That's the end of Iver's story, and we want to know, what moment in this story stayed with you the longest? Drop it in the comments below. Every single story on this channel exists to remind you that survival is not the end of the story, it's where the real one begins. If this moved you, share it with someone who needs it today. Subscribe and turn on your notifications. We put out new stories every week, stories that are real in the ways that matter, stories that do not look away. We will see you in the next one.